Before we get started, a quick shout out to the Gradsock, without whom this series wouldn't be possible. Like Richard the Lionheart, they know how to build winning teams and deploying the right support at the right time. Sure, you're not taking on vast Saracen armies on the Third Crusade, but an overflowing inbox and a deadline to-do list can feel just as stressful. Enter the Gradsock. When you think of medieval armies needing support, you think mercenaries. You need interns. Bright, hungry interns, chosen specifically for whatever you need. The Gradsock take care of everything: recruitment, payroll and management. So all you need to do is point your interns at an objective and watch them win. Pope Julius II famously enlisted Swiss mercenaries to guard the Vatican during the Italian Wars, and 500 years later, they're still on duty. Who knows what enlisting interns could do for you? Deploy reinforcements now at thegradsock.com. Welcome to Bite-Sized Battles. The Angevins, a name many are not familiar with. But if you've ever heard of the likes of the much celebrated Richard the Lionheart and the much maligned King John, you already know of their most famous offspring. But Richard and John were just two of a family of warriors who created an Anglo-French empire stretching from Scotland and Ireland to the borders of Spain, centred on a French county by the name of Anjou. These men and women have gone down in fame and infamy, and their stories are inextricable from those of the Third Crusade, Robin Hood, and Magna Carta. Simultaneously the kings of England and dukes of Normandy and France, they set in motion the seismic collision of the English and French crowns, a collision which rippled through the next 8 centuries. They fought with the French, the popes, Muslim sultans, and most of all with each other and their own barons. It's clear they loved sword scything and axe hacking, and they could be ruthless and murderous too. But they were also energetic, magnanimous, just and forgiving. They could, in short, boast of great kingship, while simultaneously demonstrating the very worst of it. This is the series that explores the dizzying highs and devastating lows of a dynasty which shaped the histories of the British Isles, Europe, the Levant, and even through Magna Carta, many of today's democracies across the world. This is the story of the Angevins. I'm Andrew Mackenzie. This is Bite-Sized Battles, and welcome to the first episode of the Angevins, Anarchy. The mood aboard the White Ship was raucous. The 300 young Anglo-Norman nobles draining goblets of strong, rich wine, as much coursing down their faces as down their throats. They sang, they argued, they laughed. They were jubilant. Most were the heirs of the great lords of England and Normandy. The two realms joined together just 54 years earlier, when William the Conqueror had sailed across the Channel for the English throne. Now, in 1120, the son of the Conqueror's shipmaster was a shipmaster himself, and he partied along with the other revellers. After all, there was much to celebrate. They were rich and powerful, and not yet burdened with the responsibility of their father's duchies and counties. Blessed with the flower and invincibility of youth, they were free to enjoy excess and revelry. And best of all, they had just beaten the French. The English king Henry I had just given his French counterpart Louis VI a good spanking at the Battle of Bremule, forcing Louis to recognise Henry's son as the Duke of Normandy. This son was William Aetheling, and it was William who led the drunken festivities aboard the White Ship. At just 17 years old, he had the future laid out in front of him. Already Duke of Normandy, and the future King of England. His father, King Henry, had taken another ship back to England a while earlier, and like many a teenager once their father leaves them, William went wild with his friends. They caroused on cask-loads of wine and were said to be disorderly and debauched. A group of priests arrived to bless the ship before it left, but were chased off with jeers and hoots and laughter and much kicking. There were some who sensed that this level of drunkenness was a little too reckless for a crossing of the English Channel, especially as now the partying had gone on so long that night had long fallen. These wiser heads included a certain Stephen of Blois, a grandson of William the Conqueror. He and a small number of others disembarked before it set sail. That he did so changed the history of England. A butcher named Berold passed Stephen of Blois as he left, desperate to get debts owed to him by these young drunkards. But good luck with that. He tried to reason with them, but reason had long left them by this point. So much so that when someone eventually realised they should probably set off, they also had the brilliant idea that they should try to overtake the king's ship that had left by now, hours earlier. The white ship was fast, designed like a large but sleek Viking longboat, and had recently been refitted. Even so, speedy as she was, it would be a stretch. But William Aetheling laughed drunkenly, shouting excitedly that they should try. The party vibe switched immediately to a hive of slovenly activity. Rowers stumbled to their benches, grasping oars with vice-like grips but scant coordination. The sail was unfurled and tied down erratically. The white ship lurched forward to great cheers and laughter, even as poor old Berold the butcher shouted to be let off. But it was too late. It was too late. At the mouth of the exit of the harbour of Barfleur, there still stands today a rock, which, like the Titanic's iceberg, is only the visible tip of a much larger underwater ship killer. Usually in the daytime, with a sober and competent crew, it posed no real danger. It could be avoided. But none of that was true on this moonlit November night. It was midnight now, and silvery dark. The white ship had got up some real momentum, driven along at speed as the wind filled the sail, despite the rowers' bumbling strokes. William Aetheling's joy must have been palpable as he whooped in delight as the ship cut through the waves, wind flying through his hair, sea spray soaking his face. The rest of the passengers joined him in his wild abandon. To be young, drunk, and riding a great ship at speed across a silver dark sea. But the dream was suddenly and savagely cut short. Just as the open sea yawned in front of them, the crew's careless haste caused the white ship to suddenly lurch portside. The helmsman's eyes widened in panic as he heaved all his weight on the rudder while screaming orders at the oarsmen. His panicked efforts were in vain. The white ship's port side violently caught the ship-killing rock, renting the air with an appalling screech of shattered wood, mingling grotesquely with the shrieks of rowers crushed by the whips of their oars. All 300 passengers and crew were abruptly thrown to the deck or the sea, and as water gushed through the gash in its side, the white ship immediately began to capsize. Snapping into sobriety, some of William's bodyguard instantly thrust him into a small skiff, with barely room for 2 or 3. They pushed away just as everyone else was tipped screaming into the black water. As William was rowed to safety, anguish and grief swept over him. What had happened? Only seconds before he had felt the best he ever had. Now he was listening to the terrible and terrified screams of people desperately struggling in cold water. And then, over the cacophony of terror, he heard his sister, Matilda, crying out for him. He could hear the panic in her voice. Over and over again she cried his name in ever-increasing fear. He could not bear it. ordering his men to steer the little boat back to save her, it was instead swamped by dozens of men and women in a frenzied state of terror. Instead of rescuing Matilda, he had doomed himself. The skiff was tipped over by 100 grasping hands, plunging William, the heir to the Kingdom of England, into the water along with everyone else. Within just a few minutes, he and all the rest of them had succumbed to the dread cold of a November sea and slipped beneath the waves. The only survivor was Berold the Butcher, who had managed to cling to the rock that had caused the disaster in the first place, and later told the story. The White Ship disaster was a catastrophe for almost the entire Anglo-Norman nobility. But first among the grievers was King Henry. William Aetheling had been his only legitimate son, his only heir. The Aetheling's death was shortly to throw England into anarchy. When Henry heard of his son's death, it said he was inconsolable. Our main source for the White Ship disaster is the contemporary English chronicler Orderic Vitalis. He described what happened when the news reached the king. So sudden was the shock and so severe his anguish that he instantly fell to the ground. But being raised up by his friends, he was conducted to his chamber and gave free course to the bitterness of his grief. He was said to have never smiled again. It wasn't only his son he grieved for. He grieved for the only scion of his house, the man who was supposed to take the Anglo-Norman realm to new heights after he, Henry, had finally crawled to the grave. Henry had fought his own brother for England and Normandy's thrones years earlier, had dealt with rebellious barons and warred against the King of France. He had worked tirelessly to secure its future. Now all his efforts were in vain, and at about 52 years old, he could hardly think of starting again. But, in desperation, he tried. The very next year, after a medieval bout of speed dating, Henry eventually swiped right on a beautiful young woman named Adeliza of Louvain, who at just 18 years old had the youth and vitality to bear him a new heir. The newlyweds gave conception a real shot, with Adeliza joining Henry even while he travelled. But no children came, and with Adeliza bearing 7 children for her second husband later in life, it was probably Henry who was firing blanks. So, with what I imagine was great sadness and longing for what might have been, Henry began looking around for other possible heirs once his health started to falter. He probably considered his illegitimate son, Robert of Gloucester, but inheritance tradition would have made that choice unpopular with the nobles. He may have considered some others too, but it seems his sight might have settled on his nephew, Stephen of Blois, the same Stephen who had disembarked the White Ship before it set sail. Henry even arranged a good marriage for him. So while no formal announcement ever came, Stephen, a grandson of William the Conqueror, probably had good reason to think he would soon be the King of England and Duke of Normandy. Fate, however, wasn't finished. Henry did have a legitimate daughter, another Matilda, a different one to the Matilda who drowned in 1120, because why wouldn't you give 2 of your daughters the same name? The elder and very much alive Matilda had been an empress, and still carried the title when she returned to England after her husband, the Holy Roman Emperor, died of cancer. With all the prestige and cachet the title Empress gave her, Henry knew just what to do. He decided he preferred his own line to continue, rather than hand the thrones to Stephen, even if it was to be through a daughter. Naming Empress Matilda the heir to England and Normandy, Henry had all his nobles attend court to swear that they would be loyal to her after his death, including Stephen of Blois, who had a small mushroom cloud coming out of his head. Henry was aware many of the nobles were still very unsure about having a queen and duchess rule over them once he had gone, so he had them swear loyalty to Matilda no less than 3 times over the next few years. It was all he could do. Henry eventually died in 1135, and nearly all those nobles who had sworn loyalty to Matilda proved to be profoundly disloyal. Stephen of Blois raced across the English Channel from his base in northern France as soon as he heard of Henry's death. He made it to London, had himself crowned King of England, and was acclaimed as such by the church and nobility that had promised their acclaim to Matilda. Imagine her face when she heard. She had been fighting rebels with her new husband, the Count of Anjou, Geoffrey Plantagenet, when news reached them of Henry's death and Stephen's betrayal. She was incensed. You can see it from Stephen's perspective. He's a grandson of William the Conqueror through his mother Adela, and Matilda had always been supposed to continue being Empress of the Holy Roman Empire before her husband's untimely demise. Before fate twisted that particular knife, it had seemed that it was he, Stephen, who Henry was lining up to be his heir. And yet fate did twist that knife, and so Matilda came back on the scene. She was a granddaughter of William the Conqueror, daughter of the late King Henry I, and his nominated heir. But she was a woman, and that, essentially, is what it boiled down to for most of the English nobility. Hereditary inheritance, that a monarch's children would inherit the throne, had not yet become the accepted or long-established custom. The job could go to whoever commanded loyalty, and right now, that was Stephen. But all was not lost for Matilda. She did have allies, the most important of which was her half-brother Robert of Gloucester, a powerful noble and skilled general. So Matilda left her husband Geoffrey to conquer Normandy in her name, while she travelled to England to begin, with Gloucester by her side, what was to become a bloody and brutal civil war. You might think that Stephen held most of the cards, which he did, but he had a major problem. While he was supported by much of the nobility, he was also despised by them. Ironically, because it said he was an affable man, likeable to most people, but weak and indecisive to nobles. He had enough about him to seize the throne when it mattered most, but lacked a ruthlessness that nobles crave in a king. So while they nodded to his authority, they actually ran their earldoms and counties as semi-autonomous fiefdoms, building unlicensed castles and hiring mercenaries to enforce a brutal will upon the people. This weakness at the centre also inspired other enemies of Stephen. When Matilda landed in England, she was heartened to hear that the Scots and Welsh were also attacking, mostly with their own aims in mind, but with the effect of splitting Stephen's focus. And that split focus led to the first major move of the war. A man named Earl Ranulph, petitioned to bring back the name Ranulph, by the way, decided he wanted to capture his mother's ancestral castle at Lincoln. Only trouble was that it was held by Stephen's men. So they concocted a little plan. Ranulph and his brother waited for most of the garrison to go hunting, and then sent their wives on a friendly and perfectly innocent trip to visit the Castellan's wife. A while later, Ranulph shows up at the gates wearing no armour and with only 3 companions, saying he's there to pick up his wife and sister-in-law. How sweet. But when he was let in, he and his 3 men overpowered the small number of guards left behind and opened the gate to his small army waiting outside. How very Odyssean. King Stephen was enraged when he heard, and allowed himself to be drawn to Lincoln Castle like a moth to a flame, laying siege to it in a bid to retake it quickly. But Ranulph somehow escaped the castle, made his way to Robert of Gloucester, and pledged himself to Empress Matilda's cause, offering up Stephen's unsuspecting army in return. Gloucester couldn't believe his luck. He and his forces moved quickly across difficult ground, crossing at least 2 rivers to reach Stephen fast enough to catch him by surprise. Stephen was surprised, but not panicked. When his scouts spotted Gloucester's approaching army, he drew his own up in battle lines. Outnumbered, many of his advisers urged retreat, but Stephen, feeling fresh and eager for success, was ready for a fight. So too was Gloucester. He gave a rousing speech to his men, saying, quote, "There is one thing, brave nobles and soldiers all, which I wish to impress upon your minds. There is no possibility of retreat over the marches which you have just crossed with difficulty. Here, therefore, you must either conquer or die, for there is no hope of safety in flight. The only course that remains is to open a way to the city with your swords." This do-or-die speech then goes on to basically become a long diss track of the enemies facing them. Again, quote, "There is Alan of Brittany in arms against us, nay, against God himself, a man so execrable, so polluted with every sort of wickedness that his equal in crime cannot be found. Then we have opposed to us the Earl of Menant, crafty, perfidious, whose heart is naturally imbued with dishonesty, his tongue with fraud, his bearing with cowardice. Slow in advance, quick in retreat, the last in fight, the first in flight. Next we have against us Earl Hugh, who not only makes light of his breach of fealty against the Empress, but has perjured himself most blatantly a second time, affirming that King Henry conferred the crown on Stephen, and that the king's daughter abdicated in his favour. Then we have the Earl of Albemarle, a man singularly consistent in his wicked courses, prompt to embark in them, incapable of relinquishing them, from whom his own wife was compelled to become a fugitive on account of his intolerable filthiness. The Earl also marches against us who carried off the Countess just named, a most flagrant adulterer and a most eminent bawd, a slave to Bacchus and no friend to Mars, redolent of wine, indolent of war. With him comes Simon, Earl of Northampton, who never acts but talks, who never gives but promises, who thinks that when he has said a thing, he has done it, when he has promised, he has performed. So the rest of Stephen's nobles, they are like the king, practised in robbery, rapacious for plunder, steeped in blood, and all alike tainted with perjury. If you are of one mind in executing the divine judgment, swear to advance, execrate retreat, and in token of it, unanimously raise your hands to heaven. And raise their hands and voices they did, because just as one of Stephen's men began to give speeches to the king's army, Gloucester's troops began to surge forward with swords drawn, cutting him short. According to the chronicler Henry of Huntingdon, the shouts of the advancing enemy were heard, mingled with the blasts of their trumpets and the trampling of the horses, making the ground to quake. The battle took place on an open field in front of Lincoln's city walls, with its citizens watching from the battlements. They watched as Gloucester's army set upon Stephen's, savaging it with the fury of righteousness and vigour that Gloucester's speech had given them. Stephen's right flank took the full force of a vicious cavalry charge, war cries erupting from the riders' lips. The charge was so ferocious that Stephen's right wing disintegrated under a flurry of steel and hate, men going from determined warriors to terrified fugitives in seconds. The king looked at first to have more success on the opposite flank, when Stephen's knights crumpled Gloucester's right, but a well-timed countercharge by Earl Ranulph had them scattered in a moment and put to flight. With both Stephen's flanks sent running, the fighting drew to his centre, surrounded but undaunted. The men-at-arms, mailed and steadfast, fought viciously to protect the king. Hand-to-hand fighting is always gruesome, and this was no different. Spears gouged and swords slashed, axes hacked and arrows pierced. Henry of Huntingdon wrote, "The battle raged terribly around this circle. Helmets and swords gleamed as they clashed, and the fearful screams and shouts re-echoed from the neighbouring hill and city walls. The noise was thunderous." Gloucester's cavalry charged the crush of massed men in the centre, sending many flying, killing others, dragging some away. Still Stephen's men held around him, an armoured wall flailing death around and screaming to be given more blood. Stephen himself was deep in the midst of the battle and fighting savagely. Stephen was no slouch and had already proved himself in battles against the French years earlier. He was brave and strong, and he set about him with almost inhuman violence, snarling and scything. So brutal were his blows that his sword splintered in two and he was passed a great battle-axe instead. Huntingdon writes, "Assailants recoiled from the unmatched force of his terrible arm. Earl Ranulph, seeing this and envious of the glory the king was gaining, threw himself upon him with the whole weight of his men-at-arms. Even then the king's courage did not fail, but his heavy battle-axe gleamed like lightning, striking down some, bearing back others. At length, even this was finally shattered by repeated blows. Even as Stephen's second weapon broke under the strength of his own strikes, he prepared to fight on, slamming mailed fists into his enemies. But a glorious death was kept from him when he lost his helmet, and a simple stone was thrown from somewhere deep in the melee, striking him on the head and stunning him into unconsciousness. Seeing him go down, the rest of his men threw down their weapons in surrender, the battle ending eerily suddenly. Gloucester and Ranulph rushed to find their prize, and found Stephen bleeding from the head, but still alive. They had captured the King of England. Matilda was overjoyed when she heard, and if she had played her cards right, it could have been that the civil war would have ended there and then. But she didn't. She got cocky and made two big mistakes. The first was that when Stephen was moved to Bristol, she ordered that he be held in chains, something which broke all the rules of 12th century chivalry. Even your enemies were supposed to be treated with respect and dignity, and chaining Stephen up did no good for Matilda's popularity with either the nobles or the ordinary people of England. Blind to her first mistake, she made her second. Matilda struck for London, where she planned to be crowned Queen at Westminster. But here, her popularity took another blow. Traditionally, ahead of their coronation, monarchs-to-be would listen to ordinary people about what favours could be done for them, which taxes could be reduced, what rights could be strengthened. But Matilda, either because she was overwhelmed with a sense of urgency, lacked the common touch, or was just a blithering idiot, said she wouldn't even hear of any requests and sent petitioners away. This all went down so badly that now the people of London decided they didn't really fancy having Matilda as queen at all. An angry mob descended on Westminster, forcing her to flee ignominiously to Oxford. Chased out by wart-faced peasants with flaming torches and pitchforks. How embarrassing. And even worse, just because Stephen was banged up in prison doesn't mean his cause was finished. His wife had continued the fight, and incredibly ended up capturing Robert of Gloucester, Matilda's great champion. What a woman. Reeling from these setbacks, Matilda promptly agreed to a swap. Stephen for Robert, and now found herself besieged in Oxford Castle by a resurgent Stephen. There are only a few other moments of history where someone has managed to snatch such a defeated turnaround from the jaws of victory. She must have realised it herself, because with only a few days' worth of food left and nearly deciding to surrender, she gambled on one last throw of the dice. Deep in winter and in the dead of night, she scaled down the walls of the castle with a small band of followers. With the countryside blanketed in snow, she and her men cloaked themselves in white sheets and managed to slip past the guards. This is what the whole war was. A seesaw of success and setback for both sides. The tides turning this way and that. In the meantime, bands of mercenaries and troops of soldiers roamed and stalked the country. pillaging, raping, burning and destroying. Who actually ruled, Matilda or Stephen? In truth, neither, with local lords looking largely to their own and letting their personal armies ravage the lands of their neighbours and enemies. An unknown monk added this to the Anglo-Saxon chronicle. They cruelly oppressed the wretched men of the land with castle works, and when the castles were made, they filled them with devils and evil men. They took those whom they supposed to have any goods, and threw them into prison for their gold and silver, and inflicted on them unutterable tortures. They tied knotted strings about their heads and twisted them till the pain went into their brains. They put them into dungeons wherein were adders and snakes and toads, and so destroyed them. They made towns pay protection money, and when the wretched men had no more to give, then they plundered and burned all the towns. Then was corn dear, and meat and cheese and butter, for there was none in the land. Men starved of hunger. Never was there more wretchedness in the land, nor did heathen men ever do worse than they, for they spared neither church nor churchyard. The earth bare no corn, for the land was all laid waste by such deeds. And people said openly that Christ and his saints slept. Such things and more than we can say, we suffered 19 winters for our sins. No wonder later Victorian historians called it the Anarchy. Those 19 winters ended in 1154. 19 years of anarchy for Stephen, Matilda, their followers, and most of all, the ordinary people of England. Eventually, Matilda figured out that people didn't exactly want her as queen. They didn't exactly want Stephen either, but even if she could beat him, she couldn't see how she could rule effectively. She would just be replacing one despised monarch with another. So, back in 1148, she passed her claim to her 15-year-old son, Henry Fitz-Empress, or son of the Empress. Henry was a more acceptable choice than his mother for many of the powerful nobles, and he got straight to work rallying their support across England. By 1153, he controlled about half of the country, and it all came to a head when his army met Stephen's at Wallingford the same year. But while they faced each other across the Thames, the nobles on both sides finally decided they had had enough and convinced the church to broker a truce. Henry and Stephen met personally, and I can imagine the heat of rancour between the two men. But Stephen was still the affable man described in the chronicles, and the two of them were eager for a settlement. Finally, they came to one. Henry would recognise Stephen as king, and in exchange, Stephen would formally adopt Henry as his heir. Stephen's actual heir, Eustace, was understandably enraged, but almost too conveniently died while negotiations were ongoing. His death removed the only real obstacle to peace. And so, in 1153, peace finally came to England. Sporadic fighting continued for a few months while the mercenary bands were dismissed and disbanded, but relative quiet descended on England for the first time in 20 years. And then, in another twist of fate, Stephen died just the following year in 1154. When Henry took the throne to become Henry II, he inherited an England riven with a generation's worth of war, destruction, looting, crime, famine, and poverty. But it's said that Henry had the drive and energy of 3 men and set to work putting England back on the path to justice, security, and prosperity. And not just England, because he was also now the Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou, his father Geoffrey having died 3 years earlier. It was suddenly an empire, the Angevin Empire. The Angevins were named after the county of Anjou in France, which tended to be grouped with its neighbours, Maine and Touraine. After all, Geoffrey Plantagenet ruled them all as count. Plantagenet wasn't a surname, it was a nickname, given to Geoffrey as a young man for a particular style choice, He liked to wear a sprig of yellow flowers in his hair. We know the flower today as broom, but in Latin it's plantagenista, Plantagenet. Geoffrey of Anjou's quirk of fashion lent its name to an entire dynasty of English kings, which ruled until the Wars of the Roses climaxed when Richard III was hacked to death at the Battle of Bosworth over 300 years later. And the Plantagenet dynasty began with the Angevins. For now, with anarchy over and Henry II installed as king, everything seemed like it might be okay. Except, of course, it wasn't. Because since the days of William the Conqueror, French kings had always hated that the King of England also owned considerable lands in France. And now the King of England owned Anjou as well as Normandy, the first of the Angevins. The new French King Louis VII was not happy about that. Now throw in a little something to do with Louis's wife, and a dash of the huge Duchy of Aquitaine in southwest France, and there was big trouble brewing. Trouble that would span decades. Join us next time, because the Angevin Empire has arrived, and France doesn't like it. I'm Andrew Mackenzie. See you then. Thanks for listening.